Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Killing Me Smalls podcast. I am your host, Mike Small. You can follow me on Twitter, as you can see right there, at Real Mike Small. And if you're interesting, I'll follow you back. Today's guest, as you can see right next to me, is definitely one of my favorites. I was turned on to Mike Lombardi. I knew who he was because I'm a football fan, and I knew that he'd been with the Cleveland Browns and the Eagles and the Patriots and the Raiders and as an NFL executive. But Mike, we share a passion for the Sopranos, for Sixers basketball,
Uh,
and for the NFL. And I'm a Springsteen fan, but I'm not quite where you are. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. Yeah, the 6-year fund is a little bit of a tragedy more than it is a fandom, but yeah, all those things are great. I mean, obviously, if you grow up in the great state of New Jersey,
Yep.
you become a fan of those. So, yeah, it's good to be here. I appreciate you having me.
No, thank you. And you're coming to us from Ocean City, the one of the greatest places to be in the summer. So, Mike, I'm going to come right at you hard. So, I want to get into the Sopranos and the many states in Newark, and I want to get into the Sixers. But I think one of the most polarizing things you've ever done, at least in this area, is when you called Doug Pederson the least qualified hire, and then he goes on to win a Super Bowl. Now, you might have been proven right after last season, but looking back on that time, what do you? I'm sure people bring it up to you. What do you think about when you think back of your comments at that point and where it ended up?
Well, I mean, obviously, I wrote about it in Gridiron Genius. You know, winning, obviously, he kind of proved that he could handle the job. I think the Eagles support staff gave him tremendous help. And, you know, I think part of becoming a head coach in the NFL is there has to be a little bit of a training period. You know, Belichick, it took him 11 years before he got his head coaching job, before he got a head coaching interview. And I think oftentimes Henry Kissinger says in his memoirs, he says, when you go to Washington, you borrow on the intellectual power you bring, and you can't renew it once you're there. And I think becoming an NFL head coach is a challenging job. It's hard to renew your intellectual capacity. And I think when they hired someone from Kansas City who really hadn't done very much, I thought it was a guy that wasn't as qualified as you needed to be, because when you get into the storms, when you get into the problems, and I think he did after his first year. I mean, it was very clear. I think it's been documented in all the newspapers by the Eagle writers that it was close to Jeffrey Lurie making a decision about maybe terminating his contract in the second year. So I think there's challenges that await you. And
So it was more about his experience and less about him as a
I think
person.
from what you saw in the first year, it looked like he was copying every one of Kansas City's plays, and they weren't really, being able to handle it, and his game management. And I think a lot of that stuff, they got corrected in the offseason. I think there was a huge meeting between Jim Schwartz and the owner, and they kind of worked some things out. So, look, I think the part of the job as a broadcaster and as somebody who has an opinion is to give an opinion. I mean, it's easy to say nothing, as a lot of guys do.
There's a lot of people making a lot of money saying nothing. But the thing that I love about you, and by the way, if you're not listening to the GM Shuffle with Mike and Adnan Verk, you're missing something. That is a great damn podcast. And Mike's also a writer for The Athletic. And, we'll talk about his many other accomplishments. And one of the things that I do love about you is you do have an opinion and you share it. That's my question for you. With an opinion as strong as yours, and you are connected, I mean, your lineage is unmatched. When you think of Bill Walsh, who you worked under Bill Belichick twice. You worked under Al Davis. I mean, that is some lineage, and you are very connected in the NFL. How difficult is it for you sharing that opinion sometimes, and what kind of backlash do you get?
I think I don't know the backlash. I mean, I'm honest about what I say and what I see, and I think that's what people. I don't think it's what people want to hear. I think fans want to hear it, but I think the people that I'm friends with in the league want to hear it too. I rarely get a phone call from somebody that says, "Tell me something nice." I typically get a phone call from, "What do you see? What do you think? What do we need to do better?" I think there's always a strive for that. And I think that that's what you have to try to educate the viewers on. I think there is a huge disconnect, Mike, between the actual game of football and what's happening on the field to what the fans are being educated about. I think there's a vast gap between that, and I think it's way more complex. And I think part of it is the inability of the announcers to really educate the fans on the essence of the game.
Who
And
do you
so,
respect as an announcer?
I mean, I listen to, guys that work at it. I respect guys that understand the big picture. I mean, it's hard. Football's a game, right? If you play tight end, you
Right.
don't know, you really don't know what the offense, the secondaries coach to do. You don't know the linebackers. You don't understand the whole philosophy of the defense or the philosophy of the offense. You know your role, and you can speak to that. Football's a game that you have to see from 30,000 feet. And very few, not that they can't. Maybe Greg Olson can do it this year as he steps into the broadcast booth. But I think very few can see the game from player personnel to what happens on the field, the matchups on the field, the way to win the game, how to play the game, and speak to that. That's a challenging job, especially for ex-players who have never been part of it. I remember Ozzie Newsome when he first came up after he retired playing, and he came up into the draft meeting rooms, and he's like, I had no idea this happened up here. There's just such a vast way. And
That's
I think
another world.
we have to do a better job of trying to educate people. And that's what we try to do on the GM Shuffle. I'm not really, it's funny when you discuss politics, when a Republican attacks a Democrat or a Democrat, it's strictly within the politic realm. I'm not personally taking a shot at somebody. I'm just saying, look, I think Matt Nagy's offense is soft. Now, he can defend it. He can get mad at me, but prove to me that it's not soft. Prove to me it's not. Like, tell me that you're better on 3rd and 1. Tell me, 2 years ago, they were 31st in the league and trying to convert 3rd or 32nd in the league and convert. Like, tell me you're not. Tell me you can actually run the football. Like,
Yeah, but I've been doing this long enough and have worked with enough coaches in my past to know that they've got some egos and they don't like being criticized, especially by people that they know. So you haven't gotten any phone calls back saying, "What the hell are you talking about? And why would you say that about me?" from
I really
people that you
haven't.
know?
I really haven't. I mean, I'm sure I pissed off enough people, but I don't really, to me, when you write a book, I think the one thing that the Gridiron Genius has done for me is it's given me personal freedom. I really don't care anymore. I say what I think. And if they don't think I have
That's
enough
why I love
knowledge,
following you.
if I don't have enough, if they don't think I
Right.
have enough knowledge about football, they can read my book, because it's all there. I put it there. And if they think I'm wrong, one thing I have no problem doing is saying I'm wrong. I'll be the first to say I screwed things up. I have no problem with that. So I think, to me, like anything, if you're human and you say something, you want to be able to say it with some compelling reasons. I just don't shoot off the hip and say, Aaron Rodgers should get traded. Like, no, I think I try to explain it. Do I think Mark Murphy's part of the problem? Yes. Do I think that Aaron Rodgers has no rights? Yes. I think he's tied to so I just try to lay it out so people don't get swayed one way or the other by what the national media sometimes tends to do, is create the story. Some of these outlets are no longer interested in reporting the news. They're interested in creating the news. And sometimes somebody has to kind of change that and let that come in. Tim Tebow signs with Jacksonville. How does that make any sense to anybody? Like, if you understood how to build a football team, how does Tim Tebow going to play for Jacksonville really fit that? And I like Trent Baalke, and if Trent Baalke read what I wrote in The Athletic or talked about on the podcast, I think he would agree with what I said. I think he would completely agree with what I said.
Well, you're leading me to a point that I find really interesting right now, and that is, if you've been in the media business for a long time or you've followed it for a long time, what we're seeing now are these stories that agents seem to be leaking all day long. And all day long, there's these little blurbs, and people come out in the know based on what agents are dropping. Do you find that? Is that something that you agree with? And how do you decipher from a real story and something that was just dropped?
I work for Al Davis, so I was trained in the art of figuring out who was really responsible for the story.
That was an obsession of his, wasn't it?
It was one of his great strengths. He knew it. He knew who was leaking the story. And I always talk about this. Ben Bradley was sitting at his kitchen counter one morning around 6:30, and he gets a call from the White House. And the girl on the phone says, Mr. Bradley, the President of the United States wants to talk to you. And Lyndon Johnson says to Ben Bradley, he said, look, I've got two things for you. There was two articles written in the Post this morning. I don't know the sources on either one, because the one source was in the hospital and the other source was out of the country. So now you got me. He would go through the Washington Post and literally read and know exactly who every source was. I think I do that all the time. I mean, if I read a column, I figure out who the source is. I mean, like, I'll give you a perfect example. You're a Sixer fan. I said this on my pod. Ben Simmons, as soon as the season was over, we're going to get a video on Instagram or Twitter of him shooting threes from everywhere, because that's what his agent's job is to do, is to make sure. And that came 3 weeks later. He's in some gym shooting threes and making every one.
Yep.
Because they have to change the narrative. I'm not going to bite.
Yeah, and you also listen that, his value is much better than everybody thinks. That's Daryl Morey leaking that somewhere. I mean, it's just it's a game. It's a game.
Right. And I just don't, to me, I think at the end of the day, now do I think Simmons' value is better than what the media thinks? Probably. But do I think it's at an elite level? Probably not. So it'll all come out. And I just don't. To me, I think I'd rather say what I think than try to figure out, or who am I trying to help position their narrative. I don't really want to help anybody position. It's their job to help it. Like Deshaun Watson, this whole thing with Deshaun Watson.
Great example.
He has great leverage. He's never going to play for Houston. Well, great. He doesn't want, but he owes them all this money back. They have all the leverage. What the fans don't understand is the owners and the players, not the owners independently, but the owners and the players unanimously agreed to make sure that holdouts didn't occur, that the James Harden insisting on a trade didn't happen. And so they put rules in place.
Yep.
And those rules give the clubs a lot of leverage.
So a couple of quick football things first. Nick Sirianni, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the Eagles believe that the power of the organization is more important than the head coach. I think they believe the organization can carry the head coach, not the head coach carry the organization. And I'd never believed that. I don't think being a pro football team is like having the Dave Clark 5 run you. I'll give you a perfect Sopranos reference. They're sitting around eating a lobster. And they're all having a lobster dinner. And Jimmy Altieri says, look, this ain't the Dave Clark 5. We got to set this thing up as a paramilitary organization. Well, that's the NFL. The Eagles believe that they can really help grow a coach. They really believe that. I think they believe that because they did it with Doug and they had success. And that they knew Doug was raw and green, and they developed him. And he listened to the analytics and he listened to them. And once he won, all of a sudden, maybe he didn't listen as often. I think with Nick, they feel like they have somebody that'll listen. I think it's a really hard job for him. I think he's got he doesn't have Jim Schwartz on defense. So he's got a young defensive coordinator who's never called defenses before. He's going to play a zone concept. Can they run the ball effectively to take some of the pressure off their young quarterback when their owner doesn't want to run the ball? So I think all these things come into play. I reserve judgment. I mean, I'll wait and see what happens. I mean, if you ask me, who would I have hired, Josh McDaniels or Nick? Knowing Josh, I don't know Nick. I don't know of a better football person than Josh McDaniels that I've been around in my life.
It's interesting how much of what you just said in terms of coach development is an excuse for control and ego, right? I mean, you want somebody in there that you can control, and we're using the words develop and grow, but maybe it's yes, man. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I put it differently than yes, man. I put that they feel the power of the organization. They feel it's an organizational concept. They feel like it's united we go. And I'm not sure that's the case. I don't know if the NFL teams can operate that way. I think that the players, and I know this from experience, the players have to feel like they work for the coach. So when they stand in front of when the coach stands in front of them and he doesn't control their occupation, they have less respect for the coach.
Mm-hmm.
They listen less. They don't listen as intently. I believe this with all my heart. Fear does the work of reason. When players aren't fearful of their occupation losing it, it's hard to reason with them. Churchill said this back in the 40s. They asked him why it took so long for him to become prime minister. And he said, fear did the work of reason. It was those bombs that started bombing London that got me to become the prime minister. It would have never happened before that. And it's the same thing with the coaching football teams. You've got to be able to have, I mean, Belichick stands in front of his team. They know he's in charge. They know he can determine whether they stay or go. Nobody else. And they have to make him happy. And that's really a good, to me, that's the dynamic. And maybe I'm too old school, but to me, that's the dynamic that works. But I will say this, how teams win really never changes. How teams win never change, whether it's the 40s or whether it's 2021. How teams win don't change.
Do you look at 2017 Super Bowl as an anomaly, luck, based on what you're talking about, based on the way?
Well, I think if you look at what
it.
they've done since then, they haven't really been able to. I think, like most teams, I think they've fallen into the trap of being successful. The hardest thing to do in pro sports, in any sport, is to figure out why you won, why you lost. It's a hard thing to do. It sounds really easy, right? It sounds really easy, but it's not. And I think that, maybe the last couple of years have been a little bit of an enlightenment for them, and we'll see how they do this year.
So a couple of quick hitters. Jalen Hurts, do you feel like he could be the answer at quarterback? Or are they kidding themselves? I admit I'm a Jalen Hurts fan. I'm an Alabama fan. My daughter graduated from there. I know you worked with Saban over in Cleveland. Give me your thoughts about Jalen Hurts.
Well, look, I think he came in a tough situation, without a lot of practice, without OTA days, without a mini camp, and he kind of gets thrown into the fire. Remember, he was a kid that got benched in the Sugar Bowl because they wanted to put a passer in the game, not a runner. And I think he's made great strides going to Oklahoma throwing the football. I thought coming out of college, I thought his ability to anticipate wasn't great. I thought it was a little bit lacking in that area. That being said, I thought he improved it. But, Carson Wentz's quarterback rating was 72 last year. Jalen Hurts was just 77. So it wasn't like he was dramatically different than really what Wentz was. Wentz really had gotten hit way too much. I think Wentz's quarterbacks are like boxers. Their eye level goes down. The more they get hit, the more they tend to look at the rush and not down the field. And the number one stat to see that in is yards per attempt. And we saw Wentz is declining dramatically in that area because he got hit too much. The Eagles' offensive line was beat up. And I think part of the Eagles' issue has been the last 3 years since the Super Bowl is the health of their team. They can't stay healthy, and it's been a real issue for them. They count on older players and older players get hurt. So for me, I think you can't judge a quarterback until you at least have 16 games to evaluate him. And I think we're still in that evaluation period with Hurts and see what he does. I think we'll see him around an offense that hopefully the offensive line will play better, and we'll see what kind of a passer he becomes.
Would you be surprised if Wentz bounces back based on that assessment?
No, I wouldn't. I think Wentz will go to – the left tackle position in Indianapolis is a little bit tenuous. They signed Eric Fisher, who's coming off an Achilles tear, so he may not be back. Sam Tevy is a kid they signed from the Chargers who played left tackle. I don't know if he's going to be good enough to hold up. But Reich will run the ball more. The other thing I think they'll do different with Carson than they did in Philadelphia. Remember, when Wentz was playing, they were under center quite a bit. And then when they put Foles in the game, they became more of an RPO team because that's really all Foles can do is RPOs. And then when Wentz came back, they were really more of an RPO team. They became more of an RPO team.
Yeah.
And I think Wentz under center, I think this whole notion that shotgun is the best thing for quarterbacks is completely wrong. I think when you can get a quarterback under center, it forces the defense to play run and pass. RPO runs are not really that hard. People go to nickel, they bring their star, they bring their money, they have ways to set their run support. You can still run the ball. But I think when you have play action off when the guy's under center and he runs boots and nakeds, what's the only play in football that a quarterback actually blocks somebody?
I guess a handoff, right?
No, a naked. So what happens is when he fakes a handoff and
action,
then he goes away from the handoff, the defensive end has to go with him. Whether he has the ball and he's not sure he has the ball or not. So he's blocking a guy. It's the only play in football that the quarterback actually blocks a guy. When you take that play out, you can't run boots and nakeds out of shotgun. You take that play out, it's hard to run the ball. And so I think you'll see Wentz under center more with Jonathan Taylor, with Marlon Mack, with Hines, with some of these other backs and a really good offensive line, I think he'll play well for Frank Reich.
Yeah, those guys are good running backs. Receivers aren't great, but they didn't have any receivers in Philly either. But I agree with you. I
I
think
think,
Frank Reich's
look,
a
I
good
think
play
they'll get
designer.
Paris Campbell back. I think they do I think they'll, one thing I've learned in my life, and I think the media makes way too much of this, is Walsh used to say this all the time. The last position on the team you should fix is the receivers, because they're the ones you can find those guys. It's hard to find linemen. It's hard to find D linemen. It's hard to find quarter. It's hard to find everything else.
I don't know, man. I watched the Miami Dolphins last year. That was pretty ugly, those receivers. But yeah, no,
Their
I agree.
offensive line wasn't much better, and their quarterback. Look,
No.
Tua last year, the quarterback threw 6 passes of over 25 yards completed, 4 of them against Buffalo. So his average on yards per attempt was well under 7. He don't throw the ball down the field. Doesn't matter who your receivers
Yeah.
are.
Be interested to see what, now that they looks like they took the gloves off him or the training pants off of him, and they have new offensive, I guess 2 new offensive coordinators, the dueling offensive coordinators. I guess the Chan Gailey didn't look like Chan Gailey had any faith in him whatsoever.
I don't know if they had faith in Chan. I think probably sometimes when guys come out of retirement, it's not always the best thing.
Yeah. Mike, I'm going to take a quick break. For those who listen to this show, my daughter has a brain tumor. She's doing incredibly well. She did 15 months of chemotherapy, and we're in that mode where it can't be removed. And every 6 months, we get an MRI and hope for the best. And luckily, so far, so good. And every 6 months, we go back. We've got one coming up. And if it hasn't grown, we just keep on going. And there's a really good chance it may never grow, which that's what we're hoping for. But instead of sitting back and wallowing in self pity, she gives back. She started her own 501c3 charity, which has raised over $45,000. We've got a big casino night coming up on September 3rd. If you're interested in contributing to it, you can Venmo at small miracles, small_miracles. And if you're interested in joining the charity, for $100, you get to come out to Spring Lake Manor and you get food, beer, wine, sangrias, poker chips. There's going to be gift auctions, all kinds of cool stuff, giveaways, and every cent goes to Small Miracles. And what she's done with this charity is she's been able to buy iPads for kids who are newly diagnosed, as well as putting baskets together for kids that are going through chemotherapy that have the things that made her feel better: fuzzy socks because it was cold, things to read, puzzles, games, ways to journal. If you're interested, again, it's small_miracles on Venmo, or you can reach out to me on the podcast. So, Mike, thanks for giving me a moment there. Getting back to it, let's hit the Sixers, man. What a freaking disappointment that was to end the year. You have been very critical of Joel Embiid's conditioning. I think if you're human, you're critical of Ben Simmons and what he gave you. What do you think's got to happen in the offseason?
I wrote a column today for the Daily Coach where we talked about Giannis's ego and how he is willing to get coached hard and be the focal point of the team. And I think this whole process has been really a complete disaster because I think they've spoiled the players and they haven't indoctrinated the players into a system. And there's been a sense of entitlement. And I'm not sure it's the players' fault. I think it's more of an organizational fault, because if you don't teach players how to work hard, how do you expect them to work hard? And I think that, when Embiid's conditioning, people laughed at me 2 years ago when I talked about it. If you talk to anybody in the league, they know that. And I think it's hard in the game of the NBA today, your best player to be the center. I mean, tell me a team that has the best, that you have to get the ball in the low post to him, and and then he doesn't play all the games. He's not durable. He doesn't. So it's hard as an executive to build a team around a guy that you can't really count on. If you say trade for Damian Lillard, that's great, but what happens if Embiid gets hurt? And there's a high probability he's going to get hurt because he always gets hurt. I think there's never been a play. Last year was the first time when they lost 4-0 to Boston, was the first time he ever went through the playoffs without missing a game. So, for me, I think it's more about the culture of the team that drives me crazy. And that's one of the things that I don't expect any results to come from it. I think Daryl Morey's got a tough job in terms of trying to change the culture because you can trade Simmons, but if you keep Embiid, is he going to be in shape? Is he going to play hard? Is he going to fight? Is he going to be able to do the things it takes to be a champion like Giannis wants to do? Those are hard questions. And I think that the durability
Yeah.
is as important as ability.
I would definitely argue that Embiid was in better shape this year than he ever has been.
I would
Um,
not disagree with that. But
yeah.
do you think he's in elite shape?
Well, that's hard to tell because to your point earlier, I'm watching them run the offense to this guy who comes out to the 3-point line and has to initiate the offense at the top of the key as a center because you don't have a point guard that can get him the ball and create any spacing in order to do it. If
Yeah.
you did have that opportunity where, if you had a Damian Lillard or, some facsimile of a real point guard like a De'Aaron Fox or somebody like that can create pressure and open up shooting lanes for others. And Embiid can work his way down to the block, and he doesn't have to touch the ball as often. I think you'd see a different player.
I hope you're right. I don't know about that. I mean, I do think that his handling the ball too much results in too many turnovers.
Much too many. He had
You
10
know?
turnovers in the last 2 games of the playoffs. That's unbelievable.
Right, and everybody and look, Simmons has his own issues, but I'm not sure that if he was in better, I think he has to be in better shape. I heard from people reliably that he's back in the gym, so maybe that's a good thing. I think Morey will construct the team in a better fashion. One thing I've always believed in, Mike, is there's a production problem or a design problem.
Yeah.
And as a general manager, you're in charge of the design. And when you hang closely to the design and blame it always on the production, then you're blaming the coach. I think part of the Philly problem was the design problem. It was a design problem built on the idea that we're just going to cure and collect talent. I mean, we have Okafor after we have Embiid. I mean, how is that going to possibly work? There wasn't really a strategy to build around what they wanted to do. So I think this has been flawed from the beginning, going back to passing on trading Holiday for Nolan's Noel, picking Michael Carter-Williams over other players. I mean, over Giannis particularly. I mean, if you're tanking, why wouldn't you have taken Giannis?
There's a lot of people that made that mistake, though. He went, 16th?
Right. But my point is, if you were preparing to lose, why not take a guy who has upside and you're worried about, not winning? You're not worried about winning.
Well, let me ask you this as an executive. If you're in a situation, have you ever seen a situation like a meltdown like what Ben Simmons did? And, from a football perspective, and if you were running a football organization and you had a quarterback that did that.
Well, he would have been benched. I mean,
yeah. Well, aside from that, can you bring him back next year? Can you even try?
Example of that. Can Wentz turn it around? I think it requires mental toughness. It requires mental toughness. Does Ben Simmons, I guess the question I ask you is, does Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid have enough mental toughness to win a championship? And I've concluded this 3 years ago. They don't. They don't have enough mental toughness to do it.
I still believe Joel Embiid does with the right casting. I mean, I think if you never let Jimmy,
I think you make excuses when you start talking about the right cast of characters. I've heard that too many times in my career. Well, he's just got to play with the right guy. He's just got to. Great players make their other guys great. Great players make other players great. The other players don't make great players great.
Yeah.
Right? The other players don't make great players great. They make the other ones great. Giannis doesn't make Middleton great. I mean, he's not, and so it's just different.
Yeah, but Giannis couldn't do anything until they got Drew Holiday, and then they pulled Middleton into the, and then Middleton was sort of a joker, and now he's been good.
I think it's a design issue. I think the design.
Well, I definitely agree with you there.
And I think that if to me, before I would extend the big guy's contract, he'd have to prove that he can play 60 games as opposed to, I don't expect him to play 82, but you got to believe he's going to play and he's going to be healthy come playoff time.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy's on the ground for an elite athlete. Have you ever counted how many times a game he's on the ground?
Way too many. And I don't understand why he's diving for loose balls in a January game against Charlotte. You know what? Save yourself. So that's on Doc Rivers.
He's diving for loose balls. I think he's on the ground way too much. I mean, he's always – I mean, we kid about it on my show on VSiN. I set the over-under on 4 every night. I mean,
I heard that.
It's true. Every night he's on the ground at least four. I've never seen. Do you think Jordan was ever on the ground 4 times in one game in his
Yes,
life?
I do. I definitely do because I used to do Dean Smith's TV show, and I know that Dean Smith used to grade them on how many times they hit the floor during a game.
I'm
And
talking
I
about
know that he was all over that.
when he was a Chicago Bull. You think he
Yeah,
was on
we
four?
can look back at that.
I don't
That
think.
was a big Carolina thing. You better hit the floor. And they actually had a chart in the locker room of how many loose balls you dived for or dove for, how many charges you took, how many attempted charges. And they used to give them grades and recognize them after every game. It was kind of interesting, actually. But that's neither here nor there. But your point is definitely made. So look, we all did different things during the pandemic. I did what I thought was a great use of time, and I went back and rewatched The Sopranos again and freaking loved it like I'd never seen it before. It's a great rewatch. Are you excited about The Many Saints of Newark?
Oh, absolutely. What I'm excited about is David Chase's writing.
Yeah.
I think to me, you could call it David Chase's laundry list, and I would be excited about it because he wrote it. I mean, that's what I'm excited about. The ability for him to take a serious subject, sprinkle comedy into it,
Yeah.
and create characters that are everlasting. Neil Simon said this, and Chase proves it to the T. Neil Simon said when he was writing plays, the first time he started to write a play at his old typewriter, he would get to the part where he'd get to act 3 and he just couldn't quite make the play go. And what he found was he didn't make the characters interesting enough in act 1 and 2 for the audience to want to see him in act 3. And if you view life this way, I only want to have friends that I'm going to want to be with in act 3. They're interesting enough that I want to be with them till we get to act 3. I only want to watch TV shows where the characters are interesting enough that I want to see what happens to them in act 3. I think if you take your life, if you take the Neil Simon approach to life and manifest it, Chase does this brilliantly. He enhances the characters. We love Uncle Junior from the first minute we see him. We understand him. From the time we see him in the Vesuvio when he comes outside and he has an argument with Tony about killing a pussy bumping a little pussy, and Pussy Malanga. And so, he's made these characters so interesting. They're annoying. Janice is annoying as anybody. The mother was annoying. Ralphie's annoying, but yet we're interested in them. We're interested in them, and they have our attention. And so, to me, that's the genius of Chase. And if you go back and watch old Rockford Files that he wrote, they're as good as anything.
I used to love that show.
Of course, because the characters were interesting. James Rockford's interesting. Angel was interesting. Beth, the lawyer, was all of them. He made them all interesting. Rocky was interesting. And so as viewers, we become engaged. And to me, I'm sure Chase has made all the characters in the prequel as interesting as they were in the show.
By the way, my top Sopranos moment is not what everybody else's is. Everybody, talks about the one in the Pinelands, which was great. To me, it was Tony killing Uncle June on the golf course about his sexual preference with women.
Yeah. I mean,
that was the great. There's nothing. That was the best writing, best acting, best anything that I've ever seen on television. To me,
I think if you want to know what the show is really about, I think if you Google Tony talking to Melfi, trying to explain the situation with Vito, and that conversation between Melfi and Tony over Vito, he's a fag, and they discuss that and they go back and forth on that. Tony describes it, and they have this back and forth. And the lie and part in the show is he's wanting her advice. He's lying to her, and she's changing the direction of the show. See, the one thing that I thought Chase had this because of the idea, Chase was able to use Melfi to change the direction of the show whenever he wanted to do it. Tony would go
Ah,
in and have a meeting with her, and then he could change the show and get it going in a different direction by what she wanted to do. Because if you watch that scene, and you watch their back and forth, and you watch their language, and that you watch their exchange, and you listen to it, that's the essence of the show. And to me, that's where I find the show most interesting, is because she
ah,
is really the person controlling the show. And when he ran out of ways to where she could control the show, he had to stop. Because
okay. I'm going back and rewatching that.
if he didn't
Done.
go to therapy, if he didn't go to therapy, we would not have seen some of the shifts and some of the changes and how he dealt with things and where he
Yep.
wanted to go. So for me, it was brilliant writing, because what happens to most series is once they get past 2 billions, for example, Billions doesn't have that. So
Yeah.
we don't ever get to see the show change. They always have to come up with a new villain, a new way to create tension. Whereas with Sopranos, she was the tension. The Wire was brilliant at being able to create
Mhm.
tension because the characters were so interesting and the drugs were always the tension.
Yep.
So, to me, that scene, if you said, what is The Sopranos about? I would say, watch that scene. It's not about it's not about ethnic slurs. It's not about, sexual slurs. It's really about them two talking about a problem and how they resolve the problem.
If you've listened to this show for the last half hour, you'll understand why Mike Lombardi is so popular. He's a guy that you want to have a beer with, get an opinion, and hear about everything that you're in. Most guys that I know are interested in football, basketball, a bunch of bullshit in the media, and The Sopranos, because this couldn't have worked out better for me. Mike, thank you so much for joining the show. I hope I can have you back. I'm going
Dude,
to get a commitment from you.
anytime. Thank you.
And
Appreciate it.
shout out to our buddy Mark Grimes for booking this. Definitely thank you, Mark, for that. And Mike, hopefully, everybody takes a listen to the GM Shuffle, reads you on The Athletic, picks up your book. Is there anything else that I'm missing that we should be plugging?
The Daily Coach every morning. That's my pride and joy. I love that. That's the best thing I try to do every day. It's an email that goes. It's by Coach Raveling, Kamadi Ramsey, Trevor Cap, Alex Servacio. We all do it. We all write it, and then it tries to be. We read a book called The $1 Trillion Coach about Bill Campbell, the former head coach at Columbia University in football.
Yeah.
He won 13 games in 4 years at Columbia. He thought so highly of his coaching skills. He moved out to Menlo Park, opened up an office, and he started advising Steve Jobs, Larry Ellison, Sheryl Sandberg, and all of them. And he became a $1 trillion coach, essentially. And we felt, Coach Rav and I both felt that voice needs to be heard every day. So we write it every day.
I'm on it. Everybody, thank you for listening. Mike, thank you. All the best.
Thanks,
And
Mike.
everybody, take care. Appreciate having you.